Welcome to Astrology Off the Charts. We are three professional astrologers, friends, and lifelong students of the human experience exploring astrology through thoughtful conversation. We're glad you're here. I am Ryan Barrett.
I am Lisa Hagenbuch.
And I'm Alexander Mallon, and we are very happy that you joined us today. And we're going to jump into sort of our second production, the three of us together, to talk about what our podcast is essentially about, what's motivating us, how we even kind of came together. Isn't that what we were sort of chatting about before we started recording?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things for me in starting this was the fact that, Lisa, I know you and Alexander had been working together on some different opportunities. And then you kind of brought me in and said, I want to introduce you to Alexander. What's always fascinating to me is when you get a group of three people together or a group of four people or, any friends that are coming together and what the dynamic is between that group. What was fascinating to me was that I feel like between the three of us, it kind of flows, and, and the feeling of that is always positive.
Yeah.
And I think that's respective of maybe even the reason why we came together to do this podcast and kind of what's happening in the sky right now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. So we were kind of observing, particularly a cycle that we all thought, wow, it's just the coincidence, and isn't that what astrology and looking at cycles with astrology is all about?
Yeah.
We always sort of move through phases or times in our lives, and we do as astrology students, look at the charts to think what is happening, what's the collective umbrella under which we're all moving and growing. And we found particularly one thing. I think, Ryan, you may have a slide for us.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and pull that up here.
So we were realizing, folks, that when Lisa and Ryan and I came together, that this particularly powerful configuration that's occurring right now in 2026 is kind of coincident with the I think the substrate of what brought us together as individual practitioners. Not only how we practice, each of us with our clients and our students, but really the kind of the mindset or the thrust that we use to do our work, which I think we all thought fell under the umbrella of humanistic astrology.
Yeah, absolutely. I brought this with me again, just as this book is one of the things that we looked into um, reading as a group just to understand uh, Michael Myers' approach to this. But I think, we've also heard in the zeitgeist of, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius that's been going on since the 60s, that there's this movement of Pluto into the sign of Aquarius that, I think everybody is somewhat aware of that language. And astrology is a language. And I think, that's something for us to maybe pay attention to more as astrologers and how we're working with clients. But the fact that these three planets are coming into a very special configuration is something worth noting. And the fact that we started our podcast at the same time is kismet in a lot of ways.
I love that. That's a word you don't hear kicked around too often in this generation. But
Hmm.
kismet, coincidence, sort of a fateful, isn't it? Fateful coincidence, fateful
Yeah,
happening.
yeah,
Hmm.
definitely. Which is funny because as humanistic astrologers, I think the term fate means something very specific to us versus, there's other types of astrology that maybe look at that as, you are fated to experience certain things in your life because of your birth chart, because of the configuration. Where I think, we talked about having more influence over that in terms of how we think about our chart, how we approach it, the consciousness we bring to it. So that's something that I'm always very aware of as we're talking about this.
So
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Lisa. Love.
Oh, I was going to say, I agree. And I think, as we're all three students of consciousness and we use consciousness in our client sessions, and just the fact that these three um, were discovered beyond Saturn, that was the structure. And Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto came along and said, you can go beyond that. So we can go beyond our belief systems that we were raised in, and the consciousness of the kids, I think, coming in goes beyond the consciousness, and we have to raise them differently than we were raised. And so it
Yeah.
all kind of speaks to this minor grand trine just being fortunate timing for us to continue to just question our lives and how we want to live them and where we want to go with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we realized that folks, that when Lisa and Ryan and I came together to do podcasts and to do a broadcast on YouTube, and to speak and teach about the cycles, particularly and really the umbrella under humanistic astrology, um, we realized that we were kind of part of this, as astrology almost always does mirror. We're a part of this upwelling cycle, this zeitgeist cycle. So specifically, almost within a day or two or three that we launched our first broadcast, or first taping rather, the sun was entering the sign of Gemini, conjoining Uranus, one of the three planets in this trinity that is so important now in 2026. And Lisa, yeah, you did say something really important, that these three planets kind of broke the model of what astrologers understood, um, because for time immemorial, we could say literally fire and stars, we were able to see the heavenly bodies, therefore the astrological cycles corollary to the planets, including the planet Saturn, the most distant planet,
Hmm.
which dealt with sort of, the collective at large. But until we discovered Uranus or Neptune or Pluto,
Hmm.
we didn't have a frame of reference collectively, um, beyond what Saturn symbolizes, which is terra firma, the material social reality. But once we invented a telescope and then turned it to the stars and found the first planet beyond Saturn, Uranus, that broke that construct. In fact, the planet Uranus was discovered in 1781, and it coincides with that revolution, French Revolution, American Revolution, and Industrial Revolution, inventing a
Hmm.
telescope pointing to the stars. Breakthrough of consciousness, revolution of consciousness, revolution of society. And so we have these three planets that are about breakthrough, that are trans-Saturnian, beyond Saturn's orbit, beyond what can be seen with the naked eye. Although it is, since I'm a very avid backyard astronomer too, Uranus you are able to see it with the naked eye during some apparitions. If you know just where to look, it sort of implies the coincidence. If we know how to train our discerning mind,
Uh-huh.
if we have a concept of training the perceptive mind, or intending to see and understand beyond what is Saturn normative, we can break into larger
Yeah,
understandings, and that's really the idea of humanistic astrology.
absolutely. And isn't the term planet, doesn't it mean wandering star?
Indeed.
So I think you brought up something that's interesting, and both Lisa and I studied under a woman, Barbara J. Junko, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, and she wrote a book, Life Journeys, Creating Consciousness. And one of the things that she talks about, or used to talk about all the time when she worked with us, is that sort of those trans-Saturnian planets, including the centaurs, which are planetoids or smaller bodies that sort of move between the Kuiper Belt and the outer planets, are essentially this idea that we are sort of incarnating as the consciousness of the planet that we live on. So Earth is conscious in as much as we bring awareness to our lives, to the Earth, to everything around us. And those outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, describe consciousness in sort of this higher state. And she called them the soul energies. And so I think, that's something that fascinates me and always has. And that when we talk about these planets, in astrology, we'll call them generational planets, right? And so, they are generational in so much as they move so slowly that an entire generation of people have that planet within the same sign, and large groups of people maybe in the same degree. And typically when we look at the faster moving planets, that's going to be something where, we're more conscious of how they connect with our personality. Here we're not talking about personality, we're talking about awareness, right? So how do we then apply this to our lives, understanding that these planets maybe touch on different aspects of our higher awareness and are maybe calling in the fact that we need to be more aware of what's going on around us. We need to have more awareness about how we're interacting with other people, what we stand for as a group or as an individual. What we're allowing to stay under the surface or what we're pulling out into the open that needs to come to the light of day in order to really be dealt with. We're experiencing that as a country right now in the United States. Coming up on our Pluto return of 248 years later, we've got our Pluto return happening, and there are a lot of things that we haven't dealt with that we need to do now. So different aspects between these three specific planets are points at which we can enter a conversation, bring our awareness to it, and have a conscious discussion about what we're doing differently, how we are acting in our environment differently than we have before, because it's not just about the tribe or the family or the community. Now the individual has sort of come to the forefront, and how the individual is expressing themselves for the betterment of the group.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Lisa, you were sort of highlighting that a little bit, the idea of the collective.
Mm,
Yeah, I think it is really important because each of these slower moving planets have all recently changed signs. So that's another big marker. And so I always say to people, it's great to know where they are collectively, but plug them into your chart. Find out exactly where they are impacting you personally in your house life areas or houses. And because I look at them as kind of, if you're somebody more familiar with doing, your shadow work or doing your internal work or something, like you really want to dig into your consciousness, you can just take the reins and run with them.
yeah,
And even if you want to keep everything exactly the way it was, it's kind of impossible. And they're going to knock on your consciousness too. And they're going to spark events and situations and changes. And so I just think it's really fascinating. We'll probably get into this more in future episodes of plugging this minor grand trine into your chart because it's so significant with some new beginnings in those areas for you to just see how is it working in your life and how do you want it to work,
yeah,
exploring how you want it to work, taking the reins and the
That
fire
might
force.
that's brilliant. That might dovetail or does dovetail perfectly into the discovery of each of these three. Uranus in 1781, revolution. Neptune in mid 1800s, 1846, ideological and informational. It was, we
mm,
could say that mid 1800s, 1846 and just beyond, Marconi, radio, communication, film, photography, mass communication, mass exchange at a distance, telephone. We take it for granted, but telephone, telegraph, even, right? You think of Pony Express to get
yeah,
mail across the but telegraph. That's all coincident with Uranus and Neptune stuff. And then Pluto, 1930. What was happening in the 1930s? So what's really, I think, fascinating too, as a backyard astronomer and astrologer, we all know that astrologers don't name things that are discovered. We can try, but the astronomers govern that. The Saturnian body, the Saturnine, the proper word Saturnine, and literally the Saturnine body of Saturn, the Saturn people, the scientists, govern what names we give these discovered new
yeah,
asteroids and centaur bodies and planets, and how we even, in fact, if we even call them like Pluto, do we even call them a planet, or are they something demoted, right? We all know about Pluto getting demoted a few years ago, 10 years ago. And so astronomers name these planets and their orbits, how we understand and relate to them astronomically, which is what astrology is,
Hmm.
cycles of nature. They name them these different Greco-Roman and other gods, goddesses, which coincidentally astrologers seize upon. Oh, that's interesting. Let's see what name they've used now. What name did they call this planet? And what is that god govern or rule? There is this undeniable coincidence or coincidence.
Yes.
So astrology, these planets, these three particular, as Lisa you said, after Saturn, a whole new consciousness expansion. And what occurred in the 1700s? Revolution. The monarchy for the U.S., the monarchy was one of the first times that a nation could be born outside of the king or the monarch, or
Yeah.
this idea of a larger governing body, or a nation born of the people, by the people, for the people. That's unheard of. That's revolutionary. It's when Uranus was discovered, breakthrough. So we're at a phase of human consciousness evolution and shift that is, again, a radical departure. Lisa, you said each of these three planets, their discovery themselves of each three planets, coincident with some radical new breakthrough into a greater consciousness, revolution, or mass consciousness and communication, or Pluto, a governorship over. We could think of plutonium, like energy, like
Yeah.
fission, plutonium, nuclear power,
Hmm.
the modern space age that Pluto coincides with that we're in now. Each of these planets together, all at the same time changing signs together, is another really extraordinary rarity of this alignment that we're having 2026.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think personalizing that too somewhat is just understanding how it's affecting, and that even using that word is maybe a misnomer. It's not affecting you. As you said, the coincidence of what's happening and how that plays into the energies that are associated with each of these planets, and then how that affects individuals, or how that's representative of what is happening with individuals in terms of how their awareness is expanding, or that it is causing so much friction in their life that they need to sort of push into different areas. And I think that's one of the things that when we're talking with clients, that we always are aware of the sort of tone and tenor of these different bodies and what they represent and how that is affecting the individual, because that's an entry point to a conversation, right? Again, bringing more awareness to the situation. We can say Pluto might be going over your sun, or it might be conjunct your sun. What does that mean? Well, the energy of Pluto and the energy of the sun, the identity of the individual and what they identify with in this lifetime, or what they're learning to identify with in this lifetime, as some astrologers would point to, that Pluto moving through that means that this is a total transformation of that identity into something different, something new. But when you look at that, it's not just a moment in time, it's a cycle, right? So even this minor grand trine is the culmination of something that's been happening for a very long, for millennia. And so it gives us some insight into what that looks like. So understanding what we associate with each of these planets and how they're interacting with one another. As a minor grand trine, we're talking about uh, a trine between two of the planets, and two sextiles between those other two and the focal point of that configuration. And so, in plain terms, these are flowing, helpful, smooth energies. That doesn't mean they'll always play out that way. It could be, if we're not aware of it, if we're not applying it consciously, then it becomes something that we may struggle through because we're not really aware of how these are affecting our lives. So I just want to point that out, in that, we say that these planets affect things, and I've used that word many times, but I want to be clear that it's not a cause and effect, that it's more of the awareness that it brings in the moment when we are able to make conscious choices about how we want to deal with this in the way that we always have, or is it calling us to maybe change our thoughts and habits and behaviors in a way that maybe aligns a little bit better with this energy?
Yeah, so the sextile, just for people that may or may not be as familiar with astrology, the sextile represents kind of opportunities. So taking advantage of opportunities that may come forth um, in awareness or innovation with Uranus, with Neptune, creation energy, creativity, spirituality, developing your intuition, and then with Pluto, stepping into empowerment, and letting go of control, or standing in your empowerment if you feel like circumstances are controlling you, and trying to transcend and rebirth yourself. And then the trine are is a luck aspect, so we're talking about opportunities and luck. And so with a trine, I think sometimes you can feel a little bit like it's okay, things are going to work out, everything's going to come to me. But when you decide your course of action and how you want to direct your life, and you work with the trine, then the expansion is phenomenal. And I just want to point out that the first time that this minor grand trine configuration happened was at 1 degree. So for those of you that know your chart, if you have anything around the 1 degree mark of any sign, but particularly the with Uranus, it would be Gemini, Neptune, it would be Aries, and with Pluto, it would be Aquarius. Then you can really kind of dig into the energies in your consciousness that you want to I think it's just more about taking the reins and
Mm-hmm.
just seeing what you can do with it, saying, put it on just your list of expansion, and let the universe co-create with you.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan, I think you mentioned, this has been happening for millennia.
Yeah.
But specifically, again, when these planets were discovered by humans, when their existence astronomically was investigated and discovered, and the relevance of them in our solar system, that is, in regard to Earth and its earthbound experience in orbit astronomically.
Mm-hmm.
This was since the 1700s. So it is for a modern man, so to speak. In fact, these three planets describe, modern man, the industrial age, the age of communications, the age of the airwaves, the age of microwaves, the age of technologies. And so everything's been moving, as we know, rapidly fast. You could say
Yeah.
part of this minor grand trine, or as one astrologer, Dr. Peter Lanzillotta, as Dr. Lanzillotta coined, the transcendental trine, that the term, the epicenter of this, so the center point of this minor grand trine, Neptune. Neptune's about transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
So we have revolution, Uranus, and Neptune, transcendence, and Pluto, rebirth. Now, those are the symbolizations of these three planets. Those are actually as you said, folks, those are the coincidental things that happen societally, systemically: rebirth of society, revolution, or transcendence periods. These three now all together, it's like a huge trinity about transcendent thought. And it is a radical departure from thousands of years, tens of thousands of years of collective societal,
Mm-hmm.
which we could say is likened to Saturn structure.
Yeah.
Saturn. So the societal operative dynamic, including operating under a monarchy or something, this is a radical departure of individuation. And as we were saying when we were prepping folks, now we have kids and grandkids, if you will, grandkids
Yeah.
for us, some of us. who are communicating and developing friendships at age 4, 5, 6, and 7, around the globe. They have developing friendships from the U.S. to Tokyo. I mean, that is otherworldly. For grandparents, great grandparents, that is, beyond astronomical.
Yeah.
It's an expansion of consciousness and of co-influence, co-connection. And Lisa, you were saying, right, an expansion of social systems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things too, I've thought about this a lot lately because we as astrologers, if you're listening to the chatter within the community, if you're watching other podcasts, I think people are very quick to predict the outcomes of what these patterns mean. And if there's one thing I learned from my mentor is, you have to approach this with curiosity. You're not going to be able to divine exactly what's going to happen. You'll find evidence for your theories around, what this particular configuration means, both from a society standpoint and what's happening in the world today with different governments and how that's breaking down. And what I think is most important to understand is understanding the energies behind the planets and what they represent, and then having conscious dialogue around how that might be affecting or how you might be experiencing that, how our country might be experiencing that, how other countries might be experiencing that. But the point of it is not to say this is going to happen on this date and therefore you should be prepared for X. I
Right.
think the most important thing about this is getting us to think beyond the limitations of our own minds, of our own concepts, of the paradigms and restrictions that our tribe has put upon us.
Mm.
I think that's one of the key points of these three planets in particular is getting us to look beyond and to see something bigger than ourselves and have some curiosity about it. Don't just quickly, in the Saturn mind, as we bring it into consciousness, say this is what it means. Um, I think there's a missed opportunity in that. And again, you'll find enough evidence all day long for what you think it means, but that's not the point of these. I want to flip the listener's head on this and just say, don't come to any conclusions with this. This is more about you expanding your mind and being put in a position where you know that you don't have the answers. What do they say? The more you learn, the more you know, the more you understand that you don't know and that you don't understand. And so I think that that's the point of these particular configurations.
Yeah, I
And
think
just
it's to understand we're conscious creators. And
yeah,
so it's kind of like was it improv? It's yes and, it's like this is happening, but yeah, we can mold it even better, we can
Yeah.
continue to
and
work
and
with
that is
it.
what, right, Lisa, that is what each
Mm.
of these three planets in their times of discovery, the coincidence of their discovery, the principle, the symbol of these planets is about individuality, individual creativity, individual spontaneity, individual governance, governing of the self. Even the U.S. when Uranus was discovered, 1776, 1781. The idea of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. These are radical ideas of individuation, and these planets coincide in an individual's chart. These cycles that we have, each of us
Yeah.
coincide with that individuation, that consciousness, that come into consciousness.
Mhm.
So there is, on the one hand, briefly, there is mundane political astrology and a mundane, a whole branch of mundane political astrology that looks at nations' charts and politics and geopolitics. And we could look at these planets retrospectively, and what we do see, but the three of them together, is every 500 years they come into some powerful alignment. Every 500 years, we're in another 500-year marker right now
Mhm.
of another radical transformation societally, globally. This particular trinity of Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, with Neptune at the peak at 0 point Aries. The last time that happened was like 4,600 BC. so give or take. Certainly about 6,000 years ago. In other shows following, we'll get into this much more deeply, the exact
Hmm.
timing, exact data. But the point really is that these three together are defining individuation and psychosocial ideas that,
Yeah.
like psychology didn't exist until the 1920s, 1930s. And
Mhm.
so Western astrologers generally, well, the three of us consider ourselves humanistic astrologers. The idea that we co-create, is that what we're talking about? That the
Mhm.
individual
Yeah.
co-creates, it's not just what's happening around us, but what we do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's individuation, creation, and transformation, represent that Uranus, Neptune, Pluto.
Yeah, those are great terms for all three of them. I think, one of the things I want to bring up here too, because um one of the tenets that I practice by is that astrological symbols are neutral, right? So they're not good, they're not bad. We bring,
Because the ancients used to be, there was a benefics and
yep,
malefic. Each
Saturn was
planet
the
had a
greater
benefic.
malefic. Jupiter was the greater benefic, or is, depending on your perspective. But I want to be careful with that because again, there's shadow sides to each of these planets as well. And so, one of the things that, uh, and we can talk about this further, or we can leave it on the table. But this configuration with the Barbault basket, which is essentially, if you add Jupiter to this configuration, it creates sort of a basket shape within a chart that's happening around July 20th of this year. And André Barbault was a French astrologer who was the one who sort of pulled this out. He had predicted the major restructuring of the Soviet Union around 1955, 1989. But then he also flagged this period of collective crisis around 2020 and what happened in 2020. The world blew up. But a lot of astrologers are talking about this particular configuration as this opening of a utopian society, and that could happen. But I think again, there's some shadow sides to this as well. And I think the point of this is understanding that how human consciousness is applied to this. What is the quality with which we approach this energy, and how do we bring our best selves to this? Yes, if that happens, there's a great opportunity for us to be able to have um, more of a society that takes care of one another, that appreciates the individual and holds the individual high, but collectively takes care of one another as well. That, really surfaces all the things that we need to pull out of the dark in order to address some pretty awful things that have happened in our history. That's an opportunity, right? So if we do that, there's this feeling of progression and that we might be able to move into more of a utopian society or world. But we know we're humans and we know that we always bring our stuff to the table. And so there's going to be this opportunity to do that, but will we do it? That's the question. Um, One of my favorite authors, Whitley Strieber, I don't know if you guys follow him at all. He wrote the book Communion. He's written some fiction. He's been very focused on the visitor track of things, which is very Uranian and Plutonian, by the way, in
Visitor,
terms of
you mean when you say you mean
aliens. Yeah,
alien, and when you
yeah.
say alien, you don't mean border crossing,
Nope,
No.
kind of.
totally different. And I think the idea behind a lot of his writings is there is a new world available to all of us if we can take it. And I think that last part of that phrase is something that is very powerful. Like, can we step up to the plate? Do we have inside of us what it takes to move into that idea of what is possible? And is it going to be perfect? No, but can we at least start pushing in that direction? My hope with this configuration is that we have it, we have the opportunity to do that. Do we have it within us? Can we take it?
And speaking geopolitically, right? It's a democracy if you can keep it, right? And that's the Pluto
You got
return
it.
that the US is experiencing.
And just to go to that real quick, that configuration, a trine, yes, there's luck behind it, but there's also laziness, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So are we going to be complacent and just think that everything's going to happen for us? Or
Yeah.
do we need to really, put our own will behind it? It'll be really interesting to see what happens with Mars, the power of will, behind this, and when it hits, what's happening. So that just something else to consider.
And I think also from a Neptunian perspective, we talk about the concept of, Dolores Cannon, the two
Yep.
earths. And it's like, are we going to stay stuck in our fear or are we going to transcend into our creation?
Yeah.
So,
And these three planets coinciding with psychology, psychological ideas,
Yeah.
psychological philosophies, the idea of philosophy itself, even perhaps one could say,
Hmm.
nothing new under the sun, but it becoming the idea of philosophy and philosophical social choices, um, becoming normative, societal normative. But there's another thing that just hit me too, which was while we're having this unfold, even these planetary discoveries unfold in the Western world,
Mm.
the last 50 years, 30 years, 40 years, we've been sort of remembering and heralding. We talk about third world countries, fourth world countries. We talk about the community and social uh, uh, communities, let's say in Amazonia or the middle of Papua New Guinea, or cultures that we would consider by 21st century space age jet travel, the norm that we all have, jet travel. They're still looking up at the sky and seeing these things that they've never even dreamt of, being on a jet airplane. I mean, so we've got this idea of alternate societies, alternate consciousness, and even the awareness to preserve culture, abroad,
Yeah.
all culture, not just Western, uh, civilized culture, but humanity in general.
Yeah.
And that's another thing about the transcendental trine, the social societal is what is a society? What is a functional society? Or are these so-called primitive society? Which society is primitive?
Yeah.
It calls into question some of those ideas.
yeah.
One of the things that I think is interesting too with these three is there's this idea of personal responsibility, and which you would feel would be a bit of more of a Saturnian concept. Um, and I really associate that with Pluto. I think that there's this idea of personal power and how it's applied, and what there's sort of this karmic tie-in as well, right? With the planet Pluto, that there's this wound that we have that's looking to be healed in some way, or even, for someone that's maybe more unconscious, put on full display so that it can live or take over the individual in some respects, depending on how it's placed. And I think, we're getting an opportunity here to collectively heal some of the wounds that we have inflicted upon ourselves and upon our brothers and sisters on this planet, relative to, as what you were saying, Alexander, around, there are these societies of people that have lived so closely to the land,
Indigenous cultures, which is
indigenous
so
cultures, and yeah, and how have we sort of, sidelined them when there's a lot of wisdom there for us to learn. And I think these three planets are giving us an opportunity to really look at that and understand how we might need to revisit the ideas that they have around being stewards of the earth and taking care of ourselves, and giving back, and understanding that what we do has repercussions in the world around us, versus just doing what we want and thinking everything's just going to be fine.
and so I'm thinking about Lisa, your background, one of your
Mm.
greater gifts as a practitioner is in family constellation therapy. Maybe you could clarify,
I was
and
just
Ryan,
thinking about
evolutionary astrology.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about that because when I was learning family constellation, which is like a whole, doesn't really have anything to do with astrology, although I pair it with it, but it has to do with orders and families. And the reason, and it works so beautifully I've seen it work magic, and but essentially those principles were based off the Zulu societies. They were very primitive. So, you know, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's about understanding that there are, the structure of certain things is great to hold the container, even when we are working with it in our consciousness a little bit differently, but it does create a sense of structure and order. So
Mm.
yeah, it's you don't want to lose the strengths of our history.
Yeah.
It's a matter of transforming it into how society functions now, but not, it can be a little tricky line to balance, but I think it's important.
We've also seen the embrace over the last 30, 40 years of indigenous cultures,
Yeah.
the embrace of their art, the embrace of their food. Gosh knows, with 8 billion of us now, the embrace of medicines and indigenous knowledge about medicines and plants, and the need for an ecosystem that harbors these plants and unknown agents, whether they be plant or mushroom, or so there are all sorts of things that indigenous cultures have known.
Hmm.
Oftentimes uh, oral tradition, not written, or the majority oral tradition, not written. So these are also, there's an awareness to preserve these cultures for many very important reasons, and for the Western man, if nothing else, medicinal reasons. But it's also the health of the psyche. So a lot of indigenous cultures would say, how can you live in these boxes? How can you live with the glass? How can you live outside of the sunlight? How do you mean you have people who work at night? They don't do they sleep during the day? Who are these individuals? How
Yeah.
is there balance in their life?
We have a lot to explore.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So this might be a good time to wrap up this episode. I think we've touched on a lot of tangents that we can go down in future episodes.
So
Yeah, no,
perhaps
I
I'm sorry.
go,
Go ahead.
please.
Next time we can explore. I think, Ryan, you have a slide that you brought up, the Barbault basket. Maybe you want to throw it up as a teaser
I
for
will,
listeners.
because I was just thinking this. Lisa, you were just talking about the container that sort of holds
Mm.
this, and I'm wondering, this basket, the Barbault basket, which is happening around July 19th, 20th of this year, really is a container for consciousness in a lot of ways. And the fact that Jupiter is aligning itself with this configuration. So if you look here, this is what we were talking about at the beginning of the program, this magic triangle, or the mystic grand trine, and bringing Jupiter into this configuration on the 19th and 20th really does sort of change the pattern in terms of bringing in one of the, as traditional astrologers would say, greater benefics, where there's really an opportunity to expand even further. That's the function of Jupiter, is, it's the gift from the gods. It's the expansion point. It's what do we need? What do we need to expand and learn? What can we experience outside of ourselves, and know and understand? And so I think that there's a really great opportunity for this to hold or be a container for consciousness as we start to usher in whatever this new world is.
So we'll pick up with this chart and these ideas in our next gathering, our next episode, and expand on it a little bit, perhaps. And maybe we can clarify too how, as so-called self-named humanistic astrologers, what does that mean to be a humanistic astrologer versus perhaps an astrologer who focuses uh, on this idea of prediction, or
Mhm.
forecasting, or envisioning what's coming out at us or happening around us. I think we were chatting particularly, well, both of you, and of course, Leah. That's why we're together. So both Lisa and Ryan, when we were uh, promoting our kind of gathering ourselves rather for the program, this idea of invoking it. It's happening inside us. It's not just external. How are we happening to it? How are we part of the process?
Mm. I love that. How are we happening to it? Because as we change ourselves, we're changing, you know, the society, the collective, the planet, the,
Yeah.
you know, beyond our planet. So
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We really appreciate your time, and hopefully we've expanded your minds a little bit too.
Look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Lisa, Ryan.
thank you.
Thank you.